The Real Story with Jeannie Ives, powered by Breakthrough Ideas, Sunday evening at 7 on AM 560 The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Just updating the story about that Midtown Manhattan mass shooting, that 27-year-old who murdered 4 people before turning the gun on himself, murdered 4 people, including an NYPD officer. In terms of motive, now consider the source, CNN, but CNN has sources that are saying that the shooter had a documented mental health history. A suicide note found in his pocket cited possible CTE-related struggles and grievances with the NFL, writing, quote, "You can't go against the NFL, they'll squash you." He had asked for his brain to be studied. He played competitive football in his youth. I don't know to what age. And the belief is, again, according to CNN's reporting, according to their sources, that the shooter mistakenly arrived on the 33rd floor after following a woman into an elevator. He thought the NFL offices were on the 33rd floor, or he thought he was going to the floor in which the NFL offices were on, rather than that real estate management firm that he ended up going to that floor. So he had an AR-15, we know. Police also discovered revolver, ammo, magazines, medication, and a rifle case in his vehicle. He had a Nevada concealed carry permit. Well, that's interesting if he had a mental health history. So if that all checks out, and that's an if, then there's certainly some further questions that will be asked and answers demanded. So just updating that story. All right, turning our attention back to Russiagate reckoning. There was an interesting back and forth over at the Free Press between Jed Rubenfeld, who's a constitutional lawyer, a constitutional law professor at Yale, and Josh Hammer, who is a senior counsel for the Article 3 project. That's Mike Davis's organization. Back and forth about whether or not there is the basis for criminal prosecutions based on what we know in the classified documents that have been declassified by Tulsi Gabbard and presented for public consumption. And, actually, the two of them turn out not to be very far apart. I think Josh Hammer is more open-minded about the prospect that Obama could have some exposure, whereas Rubenfeld basically takes the position that many have taken, which is that, it covers official acts, president's immunity. This was an official act. It was not in bucket 3 of the Supreme Court's 3-bucket test when it comes to their Trump v. U.S. opinion from last year. But he writes, does Jed Rubenfeld, for Brennan, Clapper, and Comey, however, it's a different story. They aren't protected by presidential immunity. And while they certainly didn't commit treason, the Gabbard files lay out conduct that could well have been criminal. And it goes to, what they said under oath versus what we now know they understood and were saying in private communications. He also goes on to say, a case can be made that conspiracy to defraud the United States took place as well. That's a different crime than perjury. If Brennan, Clapper, and Comey jointly tried to deceive investigators or Congress about the strength of the Russiagate allegations, or about their use of the Steele dossier in the intelligence community assessment, they may have conspired to defraud the government. If they agreed to withhold material information from Trump when they briefed the new president in 2017, that could also be considered a conspiracy to defraud the government. Unlike perjury, that crime extends much more broadly to deceitful attempts to impede legitimate government functions, and as a conspiracy crime, the statute of limitations starts anew for every member of the conspiracy with any act that furthers the conspiracy. Thus, for example, Clapper's 2023 false statements to Congress could, in theory, make all 3 men prosecutable, his false statements about the use of the dossier. Interesting. And frankly, I would take Rubenfeld's point about a conspiracy charge against those three, again, perspective, possibly, and say, well, then it could also include any actions taken by President Obama after having left office that would fold him in to this conspiracy, alleged, and potentially expose him to criminal prosecution as well. Maybe. As I said yesterday, with John Ratcliffe saying there's more to come, the declassification of the annex to the Durham report, let's let it breathe. Let the information come out. Let's pore over it, discuss it, and see what we have. And I assume that's what Bondi and her strike force is doing at present. For more on this and other topics, please be joined by Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to join you on these happy topics.
Yes, well, are you aligned with the argument, at least as I've characterized it, that Professor Rubenfeld lays out?
Generally, I think you have to be. I mean, you were sufficiently iffy and indecisive, which shows that you're not rushing to judgment. And normally I would regard that as a criticism, but in this case, I mean it as a compliment.
Okay.
I'm going to start with my basic presumption, which goes from the beginning. I do not like criminal prosecutions of any public figures, particularly present and former presidents. I thought was done to Donald Trump in the interim years warped his personality and was by and large completely frivolous. This stuff, unfortunately, is much more serious in terms of the way in which these things are going. These guys did say all sorts of terrible things. They did influence the outcome of the election and so forth. They denounced as hoaxes things that turned out to be true. They pushed connections to Russia and our friend Trump, which are false and so forth. So what's happening is, let's put it this way, if you ask whether or not I think when the evidence comes out in the full, you can make out all of the elements of these various kinds of conspiracies to defraud the public and so forth, I think the answer is you probably can. I think the question that's behind what you're asking me is it prudent to let sleeping dogs lie under these circumstances, or do we want to have a vengeful getting even with them with the huge publicity that's going to entail? There is no question if you decide not to prosecute these things, there are going to be many people saying these guys escape and get away from the law, and that is indeed going to be the case. But one of the things to remember is that stuff will fade with the next tragedy. If you start prosecuting these characters, it's going to be a repeat of the Mueller situation. You'll have 22 years, all sorts of preliminary notions of one kind or another, constantly be in the news. It will be a distraction from everything else. And it's not at all sure that the body politic will better from this. The other thing to do is to simply have social sanctions against them. Mr. Obama, who you know I've sued with respect to the presidential center, suit has gone up in flames, but the presidential center is still not being built. He's taken real reputational hits, I think, recently, and probably deservedly so. But I don't know whether or not that adds up to a criminal charge. So let me put it this way. I'm sitting on a fence like this. My presumption is it would take me more than proof that the case is made. I'd want to have very solid proof of a very serious conspiracy before I'd want to push the criminal lever. I'm by and large against all of these things because what happens is every time you push a criminal level, you distort the current operation of politics in a completely destructive way. And I think that's a very hard price to pay. And sometimes it's better to let crimes go than it is to try to take care of them and mess up the current situation even more than it would otherwise be.
But the problem becomes, and I know you've anticipated this, but I want to get your reaction to it. The problem becomes, of course, is that you're unilaterally disarming because we know from previous track record what the other side will do, the cases you just mentioned against Trump. And if you let them off the hook for crimes you believe they committed and you have substantial evidence enough to, bring the case to court because you think you could get a conviction and you pass on it sort of in the interest of political comity among the body politic, then you just encourage them to continue doing it and you end up in the same place.
You're absolutely right. I mean, essentially what you're saying is if you don't prosecute them, you're playing defense 100% of the time. You'll win 80 or 85% of the time, and they'll launch some very bad blows. I'm not ignoring that when it comes to this kind of calculation. So essentially what it is which kind of miserable error is worse than the other. That's the hard problem that we have. And so the reason you're waiting, now I'm going to psychoanalyze you just for a little bit. The reason you're waiting on this is because if the evidence is kind of ho-hum, you would basically get off the thing and basically make it a political battle. But if it turns out it's overwhelmingly positive that these guys did it, then you would favor prosecution.
Well, wait. I mean, I favor.
You're not wrong.
Well, no, but even if you could make out a conspiracy charge, I think the circumstantial evidence we already have is strong for perjury charges against all three of those guys, and I think they should be prosecuted for perjury, even though I understand those are tricky prosecutions.
Yeah, you may be right. I haven't looked at the record closely enough, but again, I'm going to simply recast your statement in a position that I find more comfortable. If it's a closed case, I don't want to have the criminal prosecution. If it's an open and shut case, then in fact, I don't think I could oppose the prosecution, even if I would not leave it. My fear in this particular case is those guys have been wrong so many times in so many ways that my guess is, certainly with respect to Brennan and Clapper, is that the charges and the evidence are going to be very, very strong. Weren't they involved in the debunking of the Hunter Biden laptop?
Yes.
It was all a Russian. I mean, that's just inexcusable. And, some of these statements are coming out very close before an election are taking place. So, I mean, let me put it to this way. I'm the puck, you're the stick, and we're on ice. So you can push me around a great deal. I don't mean this as an evasion.
No, I get it. Well, I mean,
for proof, but I mean, look, I think the evidence, my guess is that where there's smoke, there's fire, and where there's fire, it's probably a big fire. Mm-hmm. And so if the evidence comes out at the level that one thinks, the test that I would use is if you were a Democrat and you saw this evidence, would you oppose the prosecution? If the answer to that question were no, then I'd go ahead with it. If the Democrats wanted to sort of rally on this thing, I would do it. But remember, the Democrats are now known as the party on the wrong side of every 80-20 split that we have. They're always taking the wrong position on everything, and I don't put it past them to do that. So one of the things that you say whenever you say something is a test, it's a test that's often right and often wrong. You hope it's more often right than wrong. And so there's nothing, as it were, that's conclusive on this sort of thing. And so I think it's premature to do it now, because the other thing you don't want to do is to bring a prosecution now on relatively shaky grounds, when if you'd waited another 6 months, the case would have been much stronger.
Well, right.
The other thing I
don't think you have to rush it. I mean, we heard from the CIA director over the weekend that there's more to come. So, I mean, yes, I think you put together as much information you get your hands on to assess the strongest case you have. Sure.
Okay. So now I'm going to ask you the same question I'm going to ask myself, just talking about this. Okay, you prosecute. Do you settle? And then the next question is going to be, for what? Fine? Nobody's going to be impressed.
No.
Jail time? How much? My guess is you probably, if you're going to prosecute this case, they have to go to jail. Do you disagree with that?
No, I don't. And I wouldn't be inclined to plea bargain with those three. No.
No, I would be inclined to plea bargain over the length of the sentence.
Yes, over the length of the sentence, sure.
But I would not be inclined to plea bargain to say essentially time served and
no.
I want you to do some community service.
No.
This stuff is really extremely serious. Let's just put it in the, now I'm going to take the other side again against myself or for myself, is what they were doing was trying to upset an election with immense consequences for the entire state of the free world, and to take a bunch of people and to defame them in a really terrible kind of way, and to do so with the notion that they are so imbued with all the wisdom about the way in which the world ought to operate that they can negate the votes of 80, 100 million people because they have better information about what we ought to do. My definition of hubris puts those two guys in hubris number one category.
Yes. And because of their hubris, I'd like to see, they're just, and the as I've said, the way they use moral indignation to cover moral turpitude. I'm talking specifically about Comey and Brennan. I want to see them in something approximating Shawshank.
Oh, my God. That's a long time. Are you going to let them dig themselves out?
No, I'm not.
I don't think so.
No.
Look, you're not talking nonsense, I'm happy to say.
Thank you.
And in fact, you may be right. But as I'm saying, in effect, look, I'm not a criminal prosecutor. I'm not a criminal lawyer. But I spend enough time around those kinds of people that I realize that in the criminal law, some of the most difficult questions are not whether or not you prosecute, but for what offense and for what level of punishment. And there's a lot of play in the joints on that. But I think if what you said is correct, and I believe it is, then it's going to be a case where these guys are involved in active subversion of basically the public offices of the United States. Criminal prosecutions are going to be in order. I wish it were done by somebody other than the Trump administration. The reason is that there's so much vengeance in Donald Trump that you don't get a clear view of this being done only for the criminal side. And Ms. Bondi is too closely identified with the president. So here's another suggestion. I don't think you want to have an independent prosecutor. Those become very dangerous. But I think before you went ahead with the prosecution, you'd like to send this around to a lot of people in the office and get their written opinions, find out what they say, and then get together so that you can make a collaborative judgment. But let me put it to you in a slightly different fashion. The president and his attorney general are sufficiently suspect themselves that it would be very unwise for them to make this as a unilateral decision without getting some intellectual backup. And that would include getting all sorts of things by people writing in the press one way or another.
I think
Blumenfeld is a very strange character. He's on every side of every issue, which I treat in this case as a compliment.
Yeah, no, I think that's smart. I think that's sound advice. I hope they do that. Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye now. And Professor Epstein joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
A large retail store just canceled a huge order, leaving MyPillow with a ton of extra MyPillows. But you know what? That's their loss and your gain. MyPillow is offering the Classic Collection for wholesale prices. Only $19.98 for a standard MyPillow. But it gets even better. For a limited time, they're going to offer the entire Classic Collection at wholesale prices. Get queen-size MyPillows for just $24.98. Upgrade to king-size for only $29.98. Get the body pillows for $39.98. And the multi-use MyPillows for only $12.98. So go to MyPillow.com and use promo code LIBERTY or call 800-489-02